John Adams said, "We should give violence a chance." He said that, and my response to that is in this episode, I want you to give conflict a chance. If you will give conflict its rightful place in your life and ask others to join with you in creating the right kind of conflict, it'll get you where you want to go. On the podcast today, I'm going to talk about a topic that I really, really enjoy. And the topic is conflict. Most people really don't like conflict, but if you see conflict for what it can be or for what it is, conflict becomes your best friend. And so I've talked about war and peace. I've talked about how businesses are like warring entities, and sometimes you go into peacetime. That's not necessarily what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about more personal conflict, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in relationships. But I think if we could turn the idea or the ideology of conflict around into something that's very beneficial and should be pursued, it changes the dynamic of the outcome of what that could be. So I want to start off by telling a story. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. I have two characters in history that I love. I love Winston Churchill, and I love him for his quirkiness. I love him for his his oratory ability. Like the guy was just a brilliant linguist. And then I love Benjamin Franklin. He's my second person that I really enjoy. And so I've been to Philadelphia, seen his gravesite. I've, read all the books on Franklin, and he's just a really, really interesting guy. The quote that I think sums up his life best is the one that says he captured lightning in a bottle while stealing the scepters from tyrants. I think that's a fascinating quote because he was essentially inventing, he created the lightning rod, and he's the guy that flew the kite and, electrified the key at the end of the string. But also he is fighting tyranny globally. He's fighting it typically through diplomacy. What people don't realize oftentimes is that Benjamin Franklin was a Quaker. And so he did not believe in violence. He didn't even believe in negative speech. So every battle that he ever faced, everything he ever created came from a place of positivity, and intent to do right, not harm. And so Benjamin Franklin oftentimes would infuriate his peers because while going through conflict, he did it in such a way that there was no conflict present. So he would take the most difficult situations, whether he's standing in front of the King of France, talking about how the King of France needed to support the American Revolution on the side of the Americans versus the British, or whether after the British colonies ceased to exist because we became a nation, he then went on behalf of America to Great Britain to essentially politicize how great it was that they allowed this freedom and then negotiated from a place of positivity. And so Benjamin Franklin is just this really fascinating person because he used words, he used who he was with such a positive influence to create change. It was said about him in his 40s that he quite possibly was the most accomplished American of his time, and maybe the most accomplished American ever, right? The guy founded fire departments. Most of the fire departments that we still see today was what he was building in Philadelphia. Libraries. He built the very first library in America because he believed that education and truth was what actually set people free. He believed in the biblical standard of truth is what creates freedom, not wealth. It's not having control of your time. He believed that truth is what set people free. So he created libraries, wanted a place where you could find truth. He did so many amazing things. I mean, the hospitals, like the first modern hospital was a result of him. He was the first postmaster. So like you look at how, back in the day when in the Wild West, when Wells Fargo was really moving stuff across the country, he was the very first to really organize kind of the postal system. He was the very first postmaster general. Just fascinating guy. But one of my favorite stories is he's going to the Continental Congress. If you remember, back before we were the United States of America, we were individual states. So he was the president of Pennsylvania. Each state had its own president, elected officials, so on and so forth. And now he's in the Continental Congress, right? So the Continental Congress were all of the states that existed, I think at this time, minus the state of Georgia, and they did not attend. But you had, I think, 12 out of the 14 states that attended this first Continental Congress. So now you have leaders of every single state present fighting for what they needed together to fight for, which they believed it was against the tyranny of Great Britain. I always think that this is the funniest thing, and I say it often, is that we were willing to go to war, and the Boston Tea Party happened because of a 2% tax on tea. Imagine if the founding fathers knew what we got taxed today, right? If you go buy a tea at Starbucks right now, you're getting taxed a whole lot more than 2%. But that's after your income tax, that's after your land tax, that's after everything else. Then you still get your sales tax in there. But interesting enough, different days, different times. But we are now fighting against the tyranny of Great Britain. And the Continental Congress is meeting. And you could imagine you've got two contemporaries in there. One, John Adams, which is the second president of the United States, to be named later on. But he's in there and he's fighting on behalf of his state. And then you have Benjamin Franklin, who's his contemporary, sitting next to him. And they're at odds, but only at odds in philosophy, because Benjamin Franklin, remember, is a Quaker. So he's going to be very diplomatic. He's going to be very positive. John Adams, not so much. If you ever read the biographies of John Adams by McCullough or others, John Adams didn't mind some contention. He didn't mind a little negativity. He didn't mind stirring it up a little bit. And oftentimes would say the unsaid. They said that John Adams would oftentimes say the thing that everyone knew and would think, but wouldn't say. Basically he was the guy that was like, let's just get this, 800-pound gorilla out in the room. Let's talk about it, right? And so John Adams, they're going back and forth, and Benjamin Franklin believed that we would have to overcome the tyranny of the British by diplomacy and by making sure that we had good relations and we could come to some sort of a tangible agreement together. John Adams did not. John Adams believed that it was time to go to war. And there's a famous phrase that he said that it's oftentimes removed from history, and I'm not sure why. But you can find certain accounts of it. But there's a statement that John Adams said to Benjamin Franklin. He said, "Mr. Franklin, sir, at some point we're going to have to give violence a chance, right? Like at some point, your Quaker ways are not going to give us freedom. Like sometimes you have to fight for what you believe. You have to stand up for what you believe." While Benjamin Franklin was always adamantly against war with Great Britain, that was the turning point, and in that Continental Congress, we decided to form, this kind of forward progression to fight Great Britain, and the Revolutionary War, ensues. We win the Revolutionary War, and this little tiny nation is birthed. It's grown into what it is today. So later on, it's said that they met again later on, and both men are in their 70s and 80s. And John Adams said to, and I guess this would be before he passed, said to Benjamin Franklin, see, sometimes war is necessary and advantageous. Like at some point, it's okay to do this. And but interesting enough, Benjamin Franklin never wanted contention. However, he didn't mind conflict. He didn't mind conflict of truths. He wanted everyone to be on the same page, fighting for truth, but in a very positive, non-contentious way. And so that's what I want to talk about just for a few minutes today, is that we should fight for contention. Like our fight for, let me rephrase that, not fight for contention. We should fight for conflict. We should push for conflict. We should try to get to a place where conflict brings truth to the surface. Oftentimes, without conflict, we just go about our day living in whatever and I'll just call it our little t truths are. Little t truths are what are true to us, but not necessarily universally true. Capital T truths are those that are universal, undeniable truths, right? It's like saying, if I jump off this balcony here, that capital T truth is gravity, right? Like gravity will ensue, I'll fall to the ground. My little T truth sitting here might believe that I could fly, but in the end, the capital T truth always prevails when little t truth, my little t truth, comes in conflict with it. So conflict oftentimes brings together our belief systems into a place of light that allows for capital T truth to either be pursued or brought to light. And so it's important to understand the importance of conflict, and to understand that conflict oftentimes does eradicate some of those little t truths that we have in our life. And so before I give you kind of 3 points on conflict, I want to challenge you for who you are. Whether you're a leader or you're aspiring to be a leader, I always say that one of the most important traits of a leader is emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? Emotional intelligence is the willingness to examine oneself for the things that you are improperly doing or properly doing, and looking at it pragmatically, right? Like when I'm looking at myself in the mirror, am I willing to judge myself against capital T truth, right? Oftentimes you need a third party. Emotionally intelligent people allow other strong people to be in their lives because they know, this is a biblical truth, that iron sharpens iron, right? Think about how to move yourself to the next level. If you always have those people around you, you've heard of them called yes men, or people that just will go along with everything that you say, then you are only as smart as who you are, right? Like you only have the intelligence that, or let's say the wisdom, knowledge and action that you can provide. However, if you put strong people around you, that's the concept of iron sharpens iron. That other very hard object can then sharpen who you are. Then you can oftentimes become better, and the whole is better. And I think that you, as you're listening, need to challenge yourself. Look around the people that are near you. Are they strong people who challenge you? Or do you just have a bunch of people that are willing to take orders sitting around you? You need to be honest with yourself. You need to be open with this. Because if everyone around you is just an order taker, you are going to be limited by your own intelligence and your own wisdom. However, if you have the people around you that are willing to challenge you, who are willing to stand up to you, who are willing to call you out to a degree and in a very intentional way, then you're on to something where you can become better than who you are. So a leader is always on the pursuit of greatness. A leader is always in the pursuit of betterment. The leader is always in pursuit of educating themselves above where they currently are. And you can't do that unless you have iron around you, unless you have someone who's willing to challenge you. So go back to conflict. If you're not seeing conflict in your life, you most likely don't have the right people around you. If you are a leader, you own your own company, and you naturally make choices without anyone ever saying, is that the right way? Are you sure? Should we do it a different way? Here's another option. Then you are going to suffer a slow death that's based on your own intelligence. And I think that we need to be very pragmatic about that in our own lives and honest about it. I see a lot of arrogant leaders out there that refuse to take the advice of others. And it is the advice of others that, as a collective whole, can take you to new heights. So let me give you 3 rules in creating conflict. I like to create it, not just for it to be created in me, but I like conflict in other people's lives, because conflict is bringing truth into the light. I don't mind conflict. I don't want it to be in a negative way, but conflict is literally just it's like the magnets that are reversed against each other, right? Like conflict is abrasion, right? It's conflict is removing the natural source of fluidity and moving in a certain direction. And so it's good for all of us. When is conflict good? Conflict is good at all times, by the way. And I've been oftentimes asked, like, is this the right time for conflict? It's always the right time for conflict. The only time that I would essentially go against myself on this concept is if conflict was present and a decisive choice was made. Once the decisive choice was made, after conflict has come, then it's time to put the conflict aside, all bond together, and move forward. Now, that doesn't mean that conflict now should never be present again in that same situation. Conflict should come back up in a consistent way, on a consistent basis, to always make us better, right? The knife blade does get dull. So here's 3 rules. Number 1, we should actively listen to all parties involved. When conflict is imminent and conflict is necessary, every party that's a part of it should be listened to. Ego is a very, very detrimental thing in squashing or removing the power of conflict, because ego is an unhealthy belief in oneself or in their abilities. And so if I'm constantly putting myself above another inside of a scenario, all I'm doing is pushing out the ability for the truth to come through in that moment of conflict. And so I believe that we should actively listen to all parties involved. I've heard that one of the greatest strengths or the greatest abilities is to learn to listen. Listening allows you to gain the insights of others while actively testing the truth. Number 2, treat each other with respect. This is important because when there's conflict, there shouldn't be an assertion of dominance. When there's conflict, there shouldn't be an assertion of dominance. When we assert dominance, again, it just pushes whatever that truth is underneath of our own either bravado or ego or whatever it is that is creating that dominance. Now, there is always a hierarchy. There's always a way to bring information to the top. There's a right and a wrong way to do this. However, in conflict, especially when warranted, we should be treating each other specific to each other and our relationship with each other with respect. If we could fight for the group's success or fight for the truth itself, then we don't have to fight for our interpersonal success within conflict. And then lastly, we need to clearly define the issue. Oftentimes, conflict is just conflict for the sake of conflict. And when we cannot actively describe what it is that we're fighting for, then it's just an emotional response. You know, many relationships, especially husband-wife, you'll find a couple that is fighting and they get, a half hour into the fight, and one will ask the other, do you know what we're actually fighting about? Like, do you know what this conflict is even about? And that's what you don't want to do. You don't want to just fight or create conflict for the sake of conflict. You want conflict for the sake of bringing truth to the forefront. And so I would say that when conflict begins, or even setting the tone of conflict, it should be to set the tone that everyone is equal in this discussion. It should be that everyone is going to be listened to and everyone has a party or a right to the table. And then thirdly, it should be clearly discussed as to what it is that we're trying to accomplish. If you use those rules in conflict, it brings the truth to the forefront, which is what we should be in the pursuit of, truth. If you're in the pursuit of truth, if you respect each other, if you listen to each other's opinions, then conflict doesn't feel negative. Conflict feels constructive. We've all been in a situation where conflict actually feels positive. It feels like we're trying to solve a problem. Versus that conflict that you know about when I talk about, it's like you're kind of like clinching, like this just doesn't feel right. It's awkward, and we don't enjoy those moments. And that's because we're not doing conflict correctly. I like to go back to Benjamin Franklin, because Ben Franklin, in his ability to choose his words prolifically, he would speak things in a positive way that allowed truth to come to light. and allow room for others to have an opinion. And if you read any of his writings, it's funny. One of the most funny interactions with him and John Adams are they have to stay in a one-bedroom room together at one of the meetings, and there's one window. And one of them wants the window open, and the other one wants the window closed. And there's an entire debate that actually is written out based on John Adams and Benjamin Franklin in a room talking through who should get the window open, who shouldn't. And they're proposing their truths, but John Adams a little bit more negative. He says that you're going to get a cold, that if you open the window and the cold air comes in and you breathe cold air all night, then you're going to get a cold. Benjamin Franklin comes in and he says, he said that basically from his everything he knew, that was unscientific, that it wasn't cold air that brings a cold. And they began to debate, right? Long story short, in kindness, Benjamin Franklin takes John Adams to a point where he is no longer interested in the conversation, and he falls asleep, and they fall asleep with the window open. And Benjamin Franklin reminds him in the morning that neither of them had a cold, and basically like pushes his point. But it's interesting because the person who is writing this down, and I don't know if one of them wrote this down or if it was observed, and then but interesting it is that they literally debated a window being open or closed for hours, to the point where one of them closes, but without contention, without arguing, without fighting. And that was the nature of who Benjamin Franklin was. John Adams, not so much. He was ready to fight. Benjamin Franklin would have the ability to keep you happy, keep you interested, and keep you fighting for truth together. To me, that's what conflict should be. It should be keeping you interested, keeping you happy, keeping you positive, while always fighting for the truth. That's good conflict. I encourage you to master the art of conflict. I would say maybe instead of using the words of John Adams, give violence a chance, I would say, what if we gave conflict a chance? What if you did it right and you could give conflict a chance in your life, in your relationships, in your business?
First thought, conflict is good all the time for the sake of bringing truth to the forefront. Mm-hmm. Can you help me understand, maybe in a workplace or a work environment, what that looks like? Because it's not walk around and find false with everything and call everyone out. Right. So could you help me maybe contextualize it for
I think in the workplace, there's always should be room set aside for conflict. In our meetings, there should be time where there's set aside. We teach in Empire what we call a win meeting structure. In the win meeting structure, there's always a time period where we should be bringing our issues to a point of resolution. When we're bringing our issues to a point of resolution, that's where conflict should be fostered. Because then it should be the thought or the group whole searching for the truth and how to make this situation or this issue better, make it go away, or make it more efficient. The sake of what I don't appreciate is when there's conflict on a whim when no one is prepared. I think there's the right timing, the right framing for it. I think oftentimes if meetings are fostered intentionally for it, then conflict actually can always have a positive outcome. I oftentimes say that in the workplace that you should complain up. I always heard, never complain. We shouldn't be complaining. I think complaining has its place as long as it's being complaining would be like a negative thought or a response towards an action or towards a situation you don't care for. It's fine as long as it's being pushed up, right? Like I don't want my employees to ever complain to their peers. I think there's a rule of thumb here. And the rule of thumb is that if you've told 3 people the same story, the same situation, and they don't have the ability or the power to change it, then you're just drawing attention to yourself. You're not actually searching for change. If you've told, and that goes with anyone, like if you have told 3 people about your situation that cannot change it or help you, then you're just searching for attention, right? Because once you get to a place of just telling the story over and over again, it's like, what is its intent? And oftentimes what happens is in the employment in the employment kind of place, it's like you have 2 or 3 peers that all begin to tell the story. Then all of a sudden they band together. Then they want change. Well, then when you come together and there's 4 or 5 employees that all are like, hey, we've all got together. We've all decided this is what we want. Now it seems like a coup when they come up versus one individual finding the right time, the right space to actually create conflict or push something towards truth. Then it's done well and proper.
So you talked about having a meeting structure that kind of facilitates bringing up conflict in a healthy way. You mentioned not being prepared as a reason why it might go awry. Are there other top reasons where conflict goes negative instead of positive?
Yeah. Conflict typically goes negative instead of positive when ego or when emotion's involved. If you can all get to a place of this is what we're trying to solve, and in trying to solve this, we're just trying to achieve the best result, that capital T truth, right? Then you can take the egos and the emotion out of it. Most people have negative conflict when they feel like their person, their ideas, their work, what they've done is being attacked. If you can remove that out of it, then conflict becomes very positive. I think one of the big changes that I've made in my life is I've gotten to a place where I just assume that I'm never 100% right, because that's the truth. We're never 100% right 100% of the time. It's impossible. And leaving space for others when it naturally leaves space for others when you just assume that that's what it is. I get into a lot of conversations about faith, about God, about my faith with people all the time. And I find that when you're talking about faith, your belief system, it either goes one of 2 ways. It either turns contentious or it turns like collaborative and open. And I would say that 99.9% of the time, my conversations end up in this collaborative, open space because, I just go about, I have my belief system. I believe what I believe. It has a foundation of what I believe is truth, has some experience tied to it. But I also then go about my beliefs about faith like this. If God is God and he is infinite and I am finite, then my understanding and belief about him has to be flawed to some degree. So therefore, how could I ever in the finite understand the infinite? And so therefore somebody else's experience of God can have a difference to mine because he's infinite while my experience is finite. So theirs might also be finite, but it might be a different experience than mine. And so I have to be very careful to not end up in every, faith-based conversation like this is truth, because I don't believe that anyone has the corner on the truth. It's like, especially when it comes to an infinite source. And so for me, most of my conversations end in wonder, curiosity, exploration, because in the end, it's like, I think that there's a natural curiosity that all of us have, not to get too deep into a faith-based conversation. But one thing I do believe about God is that I believe that God has instilled 2 things into every human's experience that actually just draws you closer to him. These are outlined in scripture, but number 1, it's what we would call creation. I look around me and you look at the divine order of all things, from stars to the recreation, to the reproductive, trees and animals. And you say, there's some divinity here. There's too much natural order to all of this. And, I believe that God shows himself through creation. And it's like, if you ever go out and just dissect creation down, you get to the place where it's like, well, there has to be a creator, right? Like there's got to be somebody that put all this together. And I believe that's the design of God. And I believe that also the second thing is, I believe that all of us have what I would call a God conscious. Something inside, an eternal spark, an eternal flame that says there's something bigger than me out there. I need to explore what that is. And I think that in the, whether somebody claims atheism or agnosticism or whatever it is, I think that all of them still, when you get to their very deepest place, it's like so you're 100% sure that there is no God? And most of them just say, well, I'm not 100% sure. And that's because I think that there's this eternal spark inside that says, there's something bigger than me in this infinite space. So going about life in that manner with the belief that I'm not 100% right about anything always leaves space for others to create conflict. I think we could do that in the workplace too. And I think that's the problem with the workplace oftentimes, is that we get to a place where we have some level of success and we think, because I've had success in this area doing it this way, that's the only area and that's the only way to do it. And that's why you see so many companies that lack innovation and they finally die. Is because someone has gotten to a place of that, like they're a staunch believer, and this is the way to do it, and we're not changing. And then you see companies die. And so I think in the workplace, when something goes wrong, and it has to be addressed, there should always be space in the workplace for error. If you go back to my fundamental belief that I'm not 100% right all the time, then I also have to believe that not everyone will be right 100% of the time. That even in their area, when I rely so much on them and I want them to crush it, I want them to be 100% accurate or 100% good at what they do, they're not going to be 100% right either. And so I have to leave enough space that if they're in pursuit of the truth, if they're in pursuit of greatness, if they're in pursuit of production and efficiency, and then I have to leave enough space for them to be wrong sometimes and to create errors sometimes. I think where we have to be careful is when you have an employee that refuses to acknowledge when they're wrong. If they refuse to acknowledge when they're wrong, then it's typically ego-based, and then there's typically no conflict that'll create a new right action. We had an employee this past week that I wouldn't say he made a mistake. I would say that he overlooked some things. And in kind of a moment that we had to bring the conflict together, it was pointed out. And you could tell he bristled. He didn't like it because the natural nature of us taking responsibility for something is hard. It's hard sometimes. And we all kind of voiced what we believed the truth to be. We all debated it. Then we came back and we all kind of had a consensus of, this is the truth. And the most powerful moment wasn't when we came to the new operating path. It was when the person who was responsible for the path that hadn't gone as well as it should have, saying, you know what, guys, this is on me. I'm sorry. I'll do my best to take this new path to where it needs to go. That conflict was the right conflict. There was no ego involved. There was plenty of space to debate our thoughts, opinions. There was plenty of space to develop the new path, and the person that could have taken it personally didn't take it personally. And we also didn't blame him. There wasn't this massive amount of blame. This is on you. It wasn't like that. It was just like, hey, what do we do to fix this? And that created the right environment. If you believe that someone does challenge you, I want you to think back on the last time they challenged you. And how did they challenge you? Because usually their challenge will reveal to you your ability to receive conflict, your ability to pursue truth. If you're having conflict for conflict's sake, and you have people that are around you that are just fighting you to fight you, or are they fighting you with the intent of making it better while not taking something away from you? The best feeling is when you can look back and realize I have had some conflict, and when we went through that process, they were fighting to actually make me better. They weren't fighting for them to take responsibility or them to get an accolade or them to rise. There was no ego involved. They're actually fighting to make all of us better, and they allowed me to actually grow in it. Then you realize, I've got the right people around me. I have people around me that are not just tearing me down, are not trying to take away, try to maybe pull some accolades their way, but they're fighting for the betterment of the company or whatever the cause is, and allowing me to still have dignity and win with them. The work environment should be everyone wins, not some win and some lose. And when one wins, someone has to lose. That's a really difficult environment. You know, I love the warrior culture. If I've been asked oftentimes, like, what type of culture would you want in the business workplace? And I've often said, I want a warrior culture. I want a culture where every day I'm challenged to be at my best. I'm called on the carpet when I don't show up at my best. And that there's such a high bar that if I can't achieve it, I'll let myself out. You know, like I'll self-dismiss. It's a self-weeding garden. That's the culture I want, you know, because that culture, we've all seen it. If you ever played on a really great sports team, or you've ever been in, you know, a group of people that are all trying to accomplish something, most people have felt that once in their life, and it's unmistakably powerful. You know, like when everybody's fighting for the good of the group, or everybody's fighting for the good of the cause. No one's taking the accolades to themselves. People are fighting to make you better when you're called out for not carrying your weight, but you also have an expectation to call others out when they're not carrying their weight. Like, there's something powerful in that. And I think that's why groups like the Navy SEALs and others are so elevated in our minds, is because that's what we believe they do on a daily basis. You know, Larry Yatch, who's part of our organization here, when he writes the book on leadership, how leadership actually works. Such a great book. But I think what made me so enamored by the book is when he talks about coordination of action among the SEAL team, because it's like, that's what we all crave. We all crave to live at our highest output, be held accountable, hold others accountable, and be recognized for what our role and responsibility is with clarity. And I think all of us want it. We all crave it. But oftentimes, because of emotions or ego, it gets in the way, and it doesn't always happen in the workplace. Thanks so much for being a part of the podcast and for listening today. I'd love to connect with you further, and you can connect with me on social media at Eddie Wilson Official on any of the social media channels.